Hello, my name is Garrett Delavan. I'm an assistant professor at Georgia State. I do language education, world language, dual language, and ESOL education. I am honored to be speaking as part of Atlanta Global Studies Symposium 2021. And my presentation for you today is co-investigating global sustainability in the world language classroom. The outline of what I'm going to go over here is first talking a little bit about why should language teachers think and teach green or environmentally, and then talk about environmental literacy as an idea for a type of learning that many states are saying should be happening across the curriculum. And we're going to talk about it as a bridge to STEM equity, as well as, of course, solving the sustainability crisis. And then we're going to talk about some green ed equity and green language programs to give you a sense of what's happening in language education and where you might fit. And then we're going to be I'm going to outline what I recommend for co-investigating stories of activism with your students in your world language classroom. And I'll be giving you example instructional sequence that is built around the idea of movie talk as an approach. And I'll give you some how-to and theory and research support for that. And then the last piece will be examples of how to get started. And I'll have videos that you can peruse once you get a copy of this presentation, but I'm going to sort of skip through them and show them, just summarize what they contain, but you will have access to them at a later time. So let's start with this question. Why should language teachers think green and teach green? This is something I've been writing about and thinking about. I have a chapter in this book arguing that teachers of multilingual learners who are learning English should be doing this. And I'm going to bring these similar ideas to world language teachers as well. I'm a former teacher of Spanish at the middle school level for 8 years and did some of this myself. And what we're thinking of in terms of why is primarily the idea of the sustainability crisis itself, right? It's urgent. If we wait around and we leave it to the science teachers and the scientists to fix this, we're going to be in trouble. And changing the attitudes of any student we come into contact with is going to be part of the solution. As well, history makes language educators complicit. We're making our living off of the dominance of languages that became powerful because they dominated nature. And we are seeing, for example, that the languages of Spanish and Portuguese, as well as English, French, and Dutch, were part of the colonization phase of history, grabbed land, cleared land to intensify agriculture and industry. That's how those languages became global languages that are often taught. And then, of course, the British Empire led industrialization, which impacted the environment even more severely, but that gave them, right, the power and energy, petroleum energy, coal energy to run much of the world, right, and to spread English. The US became the dominant power in the 1940s, primarily fueled by the chemical revolution and the scientific exploration, but then, of course, the pollution that came from it. And we're seeing now Mandarin as a language with global power rise in step with China's impact on the environment, their ecological footprint. So that's why, right? Why we should be doing this. But perhaps most importantly for folks, it engages our students that are historically marginalized who really do need a chance to get interested in what's happening in the classroom. And the problem posing curriculum that I'm proposing, where we talk about environmental problems and then solutions, has been shown time and time again to engage students who are historically marginalized. It has a long history in language education and the education of students designated as English learners. So let's look at the idea of environmental literacy, right? This is sort of adding to that list of, computer literacy, career literacy, and we can think of it as something that all content areas can touch on. We can also think of it as a way to bridge from other content areas towards STEM equity, or bringing a proportional number of marginalized students into STEM fields by getting them interested and empowered to succeed in STEM coursework. But of course, we're also, by bringing it to all content areas, solving the sustainability crisis by raising awareness. It's no secret, perhaps, to the audience that Georgia has a framework for science education that is connected to the next generation science standards, although it's not explicitly endorsing them. It's built in the same framework for K-12 science education that endorses the idea of seeing how we have interdependent relationships in ecosystems, including humans, and that humans have impacts on Earth systems, right? And so by dealing with sustainability issues in the classroom, we're dealing with science, right? And we're building students' awareness and connection to it, right? But it's also something that language arts is focusing on more and more, right? To hear, read, and tell and write empowering stories of affected communities, of activists or communities facing environmental problems, is basically to build literacy skills as well around interesting topics. And the key is to think of making sure that students see those communities as active responders to the environmental problems rather than passive victims of them. We're starting to see more books coming out about how to deal with these issues in language arts. And there's even this new genre of cli-fi, or climate fiction. And of course, there's climate nonfiction that we can read, right? The environment is not just scientific, it's also cultural. And California, as I'll display in a little more detail, has an entire curriculum around history and social studies, units that make these connections to culture, history, and the environment. And so what I would like you to consider is the way that STEM, social studies, and then all the language fields where we find ourselves as world language educators all have a role to play in making environmental content more cultural. The understanding and the impacting and the realizing that students are going to do when we expose them to this content is going to be a little bit different across the three fields, but it's going to be important to have that variety of experience, right? And we have the chance in world language classes to really talk about the cultural and personal relevance of environmental situations and issues and activist possibilities, and get in touch with students' gut feelings and the body and their spirituality, and to get the sense and the realization that people like me are taking action. So let's talk about Georgia and California in particular around environmental literacy. The question is, are they going toward where Maryland is, right? Maryland in 2011 was the first state to make environmental literacy a graduation requirement. That's not true yet in Georgia, but we do have environmental education as a field recognized by the Department of Ed, and we have several organizations cooperating with state agencies to build a plan. We've got a university that since 1998 has had a requirement for environmental awareness, our flagship university. And then we have guidelines that, like I said, a coalition of state agencies and nonprofits are working to build environmental literacy guidelines for Georgia. And there are several projects loosely aligned with one another that educators can get involved with, that you can peruse at your leisure. when you get a copy of the slides for the presentation. So it's still in flux in terms of final planning, and you can be involved in that if you get interested in that process of democratic engagement. But California, which is where I was teaching before I came to Georgia this past year, creates a really good model for where we might go. There are all sorts of ways in which educators are being asked to engage with environment and activism around the environment in all classes across the content areas. And there are 5 principles that are easy to communicate in any classroom. And the blueprint that they have for their project of bringing environmental literacy to every classroom has the support of 89% of Californians, right? And so this is something that you're not going to see probably the pushback you might worry about. So what kind of green ed equity or green language programs are out there? And this is, again, a focus on Georgia and California. Here locally, we have a preschool in Atlanta that is combining Spanish immersion with nature immersion. We have the Globe Academy, which again is a dual language school, or it has a dual language track. And there is the emphasis on sustainability in their values that they're promoting, the core values. As well, we have the DeKalb Technology and Environment Academy, which is quite close to Globe actually, which is not a language focused school, but definitely a Title I school working to make sure that environmental issues are something accessed by people of all levels of privilege, right? And that's one of the themes of equity that we're going to be talking about. A great example in California of this is the Pajaro Valley Unified School District near Monterey and Salinas, which has these demographics of students. And yet, despite being marginalized, these students, in general, these students have a district that really prioritizes giving them access to environmental education, networking with local environmental groups and education providers to give those opportunities. And they have a very detailed website helping their teachers integrate this into all their class and all their subject areas. As well, I'll mention one last school. There's a charter network in South LA, which serves low-income communities of color and has the goal to prepare conscious critical thinkers who are equipped to graduate from college and create a more equitable and sustainable world. So essentially what I'm inviting you to do is to work alongside these same types of programs in your world language classroom and make your own classroom a kind of program to build educational equity, STEM equity, and a consciousness of environmental sustainability and the ability to do something about the problems in your students. And I recommend framing it as a project of co-investigating things that you might not even know about yet with your students, and to start by focusing on stories of activism, right? Because stories engage us, right? Human stories of people who are empowered. It's a straightforward approach that I'm going to ask you to think about. I'm going to give you example issues that you could movie talk, and I'll explain what I mean by movie talk. If we're thinking in terms of the Common Core era, even though I know Georgia is not explicitly a Common Core state, the same ideas are permeating what we're doing no matter what. And that is, this is a project of engaging language learners in academic conversations, right? To build their language competency in nonfiction ideas and conversations, but also this idea of inquiry, learning new things, showing and demonstrating how to acquire new knowledge and to do academic tasks and conversations with that new knowledge, right? But also it's empowering their identities along the way to keep them engaged and to make them the kind of lifelong learners we want them to be, right? In terms of ACTFL's language of how we structure world language education. This is a project that asks us to communicate about a series of videos on topics that connect your language class to STEM and environmental literacy. And it's asking us to discuss and compare how the featured communities use culture-specific perspectives and practices of sustainability activism. So we're talking about all 5 C's of what ACTFL is asking us to do in this project. And we're focusing in particular with culture and the practices and perspectives more than the products of how they engage with environmental harm and repair. So what we're going to do, if you follow my lead, is to co-investigate with your students. We're going to give them multi-sensory experiences to pull them in, draw them in, to interest them. We're going to focus then on oral discussion of those multi-sensory experiences and particularly videos. And then we're going to move into the textual work, right, of reading and writing, reflecting and researching new similar situations. And I'll show you what I mean. The focus pedagogically here is on the combination of video and question-driven dialogue. And I want to highlight for you that there's just a simple effectiveness of video with dialogue driven by the instructor's plentiful questions. Recently, I came across, for example, the Asia Society, who's doing a lot of work supporting Chinese instruction in the United States, put out a video series that they're branding as theory, enthusiasm, and questions as like this core way to practice Chinese instruction, right? And what I want you to see here is that the questioning is so key to effective instruction, to make it dynamic and interactive, right? Because questions, we don't know what the answers are going to be, and they might generate something much more improvised and exciting for the students, right? One way to do this that I've researched is this idea of noticing and wondering, right? This is the simple effectiveness and equity of 2 questions to jumpstart and sustain dialogue. What do you notice? What do you wonder? There are no wrong answers to these questions, right? And that's what's so powerful about them as a way to kickstart what's happening, even if you kickstart it in English and then reframe and move toward your 90% target language instruction. What are we doing? We're doing part of what the 6 elements ACTFL recommends for effective instruction are, right? We're facilitating that target language comprehensibility. We're moving them through authentic resources around what's happening in cultures that speak the language. And then we're designing those interpersonal communication tasks, whether they're teacher-led or increasingly student-led, right? And of course, we have got the grammar that we're pointing out, having students notice as we go along, and they're getting the feedback of our recasts and our feedback on their use of those target structures as we move through these conversations, right? So what does it look like in the big picture before I get to the core movie talk phase? I'm recommending that you do a process that starts with you choosing a relevant environmental activism topic, letting them get a snippet of it through video or some realia that you bring or a photo that you bring to get them thinking about the issue, and allowing them to notice and wonder, to get them to buy in. And you can even, depending on the proficiency level you're teaching, you can use English to do this to guarantee they feel comfortable and excited about what's happening. Present the language skill focuses, have it clearly displayed. What are you asking them to focus on linguistically as you have the content conversation that's structured around movie talk? Referring back to your list of language skill goals, you engage in movie talk, which I will describe in a moment. After you've done the oral experience, you can move into the written language experience. You can work with the class to collaboratively build on the screen in real time, a mentor text describing, retelling the situation of the activism against the environmental problem. And then you can actually write up also a research plan of, okay, each of us is going to go to the internet, depending on skill level, age level, and access. You design this plan, and we're going to find a similar issue happening in a community that you're interested in, and you're going to bring back a report, right? So students choose and research for a certain amount of time. They repackage the knowledge for their peers and report back in the target language what they found. In novice situations, you might be involving some English in that. And I recommend then choose one of those that people seem most excited about or that you're most excited about and have that be the next topic for the class. And then you move through the cycle again, right? And this could be something that is a month-long unit or is a Friday staple in your classroom, right? That you come back to every Friday. You decide where it fits, you decide how much time you can spare for it, and experiment with how well it goes and how you might tweak it for your context. So how do you do it? Well, I want it to sound easy. So start with YouTube and Movie Talk, and I'll explain why I think those are simple enough. Movie Talk has a rather long research base, and it's essentially the following. You choose a relevant and engaging video. It can be in the target language, in English or wordless. You prepare a clearly displayed list of targeted language forms that are useful for discussing the content of the video. And then you pause frequently and use questioning. That's the key. You don't just play the video and discuss it at the end. You pause so that you can focus in on a particular event that just happened in the video and mine the video for all of the facts and ideas that students might find interesting that might drive their learning of the targeted language forms, right? By repetition without repetitiveness. So you facilitate discussion of the events, the people, the personal reactions that the students have, the predictions they're making for what might happen next, etc. You're going to maximize the target language input so that they experience 90% of the target language over the course of the movie talk. By doing most of the talking yourself, especially at the novice level. For example, recasting all students' contributions for that chance to repeat the language, but also give them the most native speaker-like or standardized version of the language. And then you're going to target, of course, the level of complexity and repetitiveness that's appropriate for your level of learner. So you get to turn, even if the movie, for example, is already in the target language, but too complex for your students to follow every word, you get to recast whatever just happened in the language that will make it comprehensible to them, focusing on main ideas and frequently used vocabulary that you know will serve them better than teaching them every single technical term that might be associated with the environmental problem, right? Okay, for intermediate and advanced levels, you're going to use more authentic, quote, authentic videos without English, right? You're also going to increase the amount of student-to-student discussion during the pauses and say, okay, we just saw this scene, discuss what you noticed and wondered with one another, and then we'll process that as a big group. That's sort of alternation between whole class and small group discussion. The hardest trick for nonfiction videos is how do you make them work for novice and intermediate levels? Movie talk with novice students that are silly or engaging animated short movies, it's easy. It's very easy, right, to keep them engaged. It's more challenging with nonfiction videos, obviously. So what do? We need to build on firmly established meaning in order to engage them in a nonfiction video with complex ideas. That means using mostly videos in English. for content that's as complex as environmental issues and community organizing, right? So after they've watched English and they know exactly what's going on, you discuss in the target language, right? And I would recommend the circling technique, which is outlined by Lichtman in 2018. It's a technique that comes from teaching or TPR storytelling, teaching proficiency through reading and storytelling, TPRS. It's essentially repetition for memory building via questions that don't feel repetitive, okay? So students respond chorally to all your questions so you can gauge their comprehension and only move forward once you know they're comprehending every question you ask. And you ask as many different question types around one idea before moving to the next idea. And that's where you get repetition without the exact same question, because you're asking a yes, no, a why, a how, a what, etc., around the same concept. All right. So how do we get started? Start locally relevant. I'm going to show you now kind of move faster through slides where you're going to have the ability to watch these movies that I found on YouTube later, but I'm giving you the sense that there's a plentiful number of videos for you in your context, in your target language, cultural contexts on YouTube to find. And this gives you a sense of how many are out there. They may not be the exact ones you use, but if you'd like to use them, they're going to be available to you when I share the slides, and you can pop them into your own PowerPoints or presentation modes, whatever you use. So start locally relevant so people get interested, right? I'm new to the Atlanta context, and I'm finding out that water quality is the big deal here. And I found several sources of activism work going on around water quality, especially in the south side and west side of Atlanta. There's also a lot of youth cleanup activism and interviews of activists that are local to Atlanta available on the web that you could movie talk your way through, right? And just get people interested in people like them in their same city doing these things. If you want to go a little farther afield, we have in Savannah a radioactive waste problem from a military installation that the local folks are fighting in a grassroots struggle that I found a very good resource on. And that sort of hints at the following. I recommend starting with neighborhood racism and classism, or discrimination against poor people, before you go global, right? So usually before you want to talk about issues far afield, you want to talk about issues right in your backyard, in students' backyard, so they feel like it definitely affects them. So it's more concrete, and you get to the abstract issues afterward, after they've got more of a sense that they care environmentally and want to do something or can do something, right? So I recommend start with environmental racism as an idea, especially if you have a highly non-white classroom, right? And it's going to be powerful, I think, to show them this gentleman here, Robert Bullard. He's the first scholar who wrote and studied this idea of environmental racism in academia. And he can, as I'll detail on the next slide, he can act as a kind of figure or a model for the kind of researcher and argument maker that students are invited to be. And interestingly, his wife, then wife, was the first lawyer who brought a major environmental racism case in Houston. And they worked as a team essentially to study and argue for these issues. And so there's a whole series of stories to tell students about the history of the environmental justice movement, which is traced usually to North Carolina and a Black community's fight against a toxic waste dump that was plan for their community in 1982. There's not only videos that are possible, of course, but there are articles and interviews that are written sources of information that students could engage with. Wait, news flash, as I prepared for this very presentation, being new to the Georgia context, I have discovered that there's a scholar of environmental, a historian of environmental activism that is now claiming environmental racism and the environmental justice movement can really be traced back to 1901 in a fight here in Atlanta, and that Atlanta is the real origin of this. This is, of course, a way to get your students excited, right? You are at the epicenter of this movement here in Atlanta. So starting local, starting with neighborhood issues and racism, environmental racism are a good way to go. I would suggest as well starting with activists that students can identify, and that might already have been covered by covering racism and students who can really identify with being on the losing end of racism. But there are many other ways to connect your students' identities by featuring activists of varying ages and backgrounds, right? And so here we have the youth climate movement, right? This is Greta Thunberg and this worldwide movement to get adults to actually do something about climate crisis so they don't inherit a ruined world is a hugely motivating thing for young people to see, right? That they, even as young people, can do something. So you can clearly plug your students into that and show them what's happening around the world after you've gotten them interested in what's happening in their neighborhoods. You could go, for example, to a 16-year-old activist on the Navajo reservation in Arizona once people are really interested and want to just see teenagers doing this thing elsewhere. You can possibly find both young and local. I found without much work, looks like a 17-year-old or 18-year-old living on a farm and talking about how drought and flooding are affecting his farm as climate changes right here in Kennesaw. I also discovered that we have a very well-known activist here in Georgia who is advocating, Karina Newsom, advocating for the African-American community to get the kind of access and to take the kind of initiative to get outside that other communities tend to be more associated with, right? And so they're seeing heroes like her inviting Black students out. And then there is a whole series of ways to show that Black activism goes way back, right, into the roots of the environmental movement. You've got issues in rural Alabama right now with water and sanitation. You've got scientists, Black scientists doing powerful work, for example, with endocrine disruption, et cetera. I mean, there's all sorts of resources out there to match the identities of most of your students and to make sure you keep diversifying and get all their identities included in what you're featuring. Okay, but in all of this, you might be wondering, wait, isn't this supposed to be about my target language community? Yes, but I think balance, right? And I think start with who your students are and get them into and identifying with the activism, and then make sure that they get a sense of what's happening around the globe and in the communities that speak the target language that you're teaching them. Here are some examples if you're a Spanish teacher like I was. Berta Cáceres, assassinated for her work fighting for indigenous land and rivers against mining in Honduras. Puerto Rico is a really fascinating place to start because they have a back to the land movement in their younger generation, growing local food as opposed to depending on shipments from the mainland. And then of course the Hurricane Maria, intensified hurricanes, climate change, people are really working to rethink Puerto Rico's response to that as well, right? And then we need to make sure that we don't forget indigenous activism. And we need to make sure that we don't museumify it or make it as if it happened in the past only and doesn't have a contemporary version. And there's plenty of resources out there about what indigenous peoples in the United States are doing close and far from us about oil and gas drilling. A closer example, for example, is fighting a pipeline here in Louisiana, where Sherry Foytlin is kind of a leader of local activism from the indigenous perspective. So that's what I want to show you as a quick ride through some example videos that you can peruse when you get access to these slides. And I want to leave you with just the final thoughts of these two questions. Just take a moment to think about which examples spoke most to you and made you think of possibilities for your practice, and maybe give yourself a chance to really let it sink in and what you might do, where you might start. But also think about your own situation in terms of the age of your students and the proficiency level of your classes. How would the issues need to be presented differently, at different grade and proficiency levels? Give yourself a chance to think about that. When you get access to my slides, feel free to use those videos that I found. They are out there for all to see, and find more that connect to your students, your context, and of course, your target language cultures. All right, thank you so much. I have put my email here for you to contact me if you have questions, or if you want to update me on what you've done already or after having seen my presentation. I'd be happy to hear from you. All right, thank you very much.